Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a closer look at El Salvador's deportation policies.
Right. Especially, thinking ahead to what might happen under a potential Trump administration in 2025 with possibly more deportations.
Exactly. We want to dig into the human rights side of things and also, well, what's going on inside El Salvador that shapes all this?
And we're drawing on some analysis here, specifically unpacking the human rights dilemma in El Salvador's deportation policies under Trump's 2025 regime. El Salvador's crackdown, which came out in April 2025.
It gives us a good framework. So our goal today for you listening is to really understand what's driving these policies in El Salvador, what the human costs might be, and how U.S. actions and Salvadoran actions kind of fit together. It's complicated.
Very.
Let's start with a bit of history, maybe, because migration isn't new for El Salvador.
Not at all. You have to go back to the Civil War, really, in the 20th century.
Yeah.
That pushed a lot of people out, created a huge Salvadoran community, especially in the U.S.
Yeah, a large diaspora.
Precisely. And that history shapes everything now. Then you had the Trump administration, and its focus on immigration definitely meant tougher U.S. deportation policies, which, well, directly affected Salvadorans.
And it's not just the history, is it? The economy in El Salvador plays a huge role in why people leave.
Oh, absolutely. You've got persistent issues, high unemployment, not many opportunities, especially for young people. It pushes them to look elsewhere.
And the money sent back home. Remittances, that's a big deal too,
A
right?
huge deal. The economy really depends on it. So it's this complex cycle. The analysis also mentions how U.S. immigration law has sort of influenced Salvadoran approaches this move towards detention, deportation, sometimes framed by international agreements, but still.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that Trump administration influence. How specifically did U.S. policies affect what El Salvador was doing?
Well, the article points to a few things. A big one was the Remain in Mexico policy, MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols. That started in 2019.
Ah, yes, I remember that, forcing asylum seekers to wait in Mexico.
Exactly. Including many Salvadorans. They had to wait there while their U.S. cases were processed. It caused enormous hardship, huge humanitarian concerns right there at the border, put people seeking safety under incredible strain.
Just sounds incredibly dangerous for vulnerable people.
It often was. And beyond that specific policy, the Trump administration was actively negotiating with the Salvadoran government. The aim was clear. Get them to ramp up immigration enforcement.
How did they do that? Negotiations.
Yeah, and often these talks involve financial incentives, tying aid or economic support to El Salvador, agreeing to stricter immigration controls.
So linking money to enforcement. Pressure.
Definitely pressure. It certainly influenced El Salvador's direction on deportations.
And what about just the general tone, the rhetoric coming out of the U.S. back then?
That's important too. The way the Trump administration talked about Central American migrants. The article suggests this kind of language, often quite harsh, might have encouraged Salvadoran officials to, well, crack down harder themselves.
Maybe without fully considering the safety of their own citizens being sent back.
That's a valid question the analysis raises. So, yeah, pressure from different directions.
Okay, this brings us to the core of it, really, the human rights concerns. Especially if we see a similar approach again in 2025, what are the biggest worries here?
There's several really serious ones. Family separation is probably top of the list.
You mean parents deported while kids stay in the U.S. or kids sent back alone?
Both scenarios. Parents deported, maybe leaving children behind in the U.S., or children returning to El Salvador without their parents. And the scary part is the support systems back in El Salvador for kids returning alone might just not be there. It makes them incredibly vulnerable.
God, the trauma.
The psychological trauma for both parents and kids, it can be immense, long-lasting effects.
Just devastating. What other rights are at risk?
Access to asylum is another major one. If deportation is too fast, too restrictive, people genuinely fleeing violence or persecution might not even get a chance to make their case.
They get sent back into danger.
Potentially, yes, without any real legal process or protection. And unfortunately, human rights groups have documented cases where people deported back did face threats to their safety. It really questions if the protection mechanisms are working.
That's incredibly worrying. And what about how people are treated during the deportation process itself?
The analysis mentions reports from rights organizations detailing mistreatment, things like poor conditions in detention centers, lack of access to lawyers, not enough medical care.
Really serious allegations.
Yes, pointing towards potential systemic problems in how people are treated during removal. violations of basic rights.
So to really understand why people leave and how these policies hit them, we need to look at life inside El Salvador, too.
Exactly. The context there is crucial. You have very high levels of violence and insecurity, largely driven by gangs like MS-13, Barrio 18.
That affects daily life massively, I imagine.
It permeates everything. It's a huge factor, pushing people to decide they just have to leave to find safety somewhere else.
And the economy we touched on earlier, that's another big push factor.
Definitely. We mentioned unemployment, but there's also high poverty, something like 26% below the national poverty line. Lots of underemployment, too.
So few decent jobs.
Very few.
Mhm.
Which loops back to the reliance on remittances. It highlights the lack of options at home. Add to that ongoing struggles within government institutions, corruption, difficulty implementing effective policies, and it creates a really tough situation for many Salvadorans.
So someone deported back often returns to the exact problems they fled. What does that do to a person, to a family?
The impact is, well, it's often deeply damaging. Think about someone who's been in the U.S. for years. Reintegrating socially can be incredibly hard.
Language barriers, maybe? Lost connections?
Yes, maybe their Spanish isn't as fluent, their social networks back home have weakened or vanished. They can feel totally isolated, even in their own country.
That's a huge burden on top of the deportation itself. The mental toll must be enormous.
It really is. Reports talk about anxiety, depression, PTSD stemming from the whole deportation ordeal, and then the struggle to rebuild a life in difficult circumstances.
And the family.
The emotional impact is huge. Kids left behind in the U.S., we mentioned that, but also returnees and their families can face stigma, social isolation back in El Salvador. These are often the hidden costs.
Wow, it's just layers upon layers of difficulty. Has there been any international reaction? Are organizations or other countries stepping in?
Yes, there has been international attention. The UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, they've both voiced concerns.
About the human rights impacts.
Exactly, stressing the need to protect vulnerable people.
What about other countries in the region?
Well, Mexico is a key player, obviously, as a transit country. They have taken some steps, offering some protective measures, support for Salvadoran migrants and deportees, like pathways to asylum or humanitarian aid. It shows some regional recognition of the issue.
And I guess NGOs, nonprofits, must be active on the ground.
Hugely important. Groups like Alianza Americas, the ACLU, they're doing critical work, advocating for fairer treatment, challenging policies in court, providing direct help to people affected.
And raising awareness, too.
Yes, and you see solidarity movements, especially in the U.S., trying to push for more humane and accountable immigration policies.
So there are laws, right, both in El Salvador and internationally, meant to protect people. How does that square with these deportation policies?
That's a key tension. El Salvador's constitution does guarantee rights like due process, protection from arbitrary detention, but the analysis suggests applying these rights effectively during deportation is, well, challenging.
How so?
A major hurdle is access to legal help. Many people being deported simply can't afford a lawyer. They don't know how to navigate the legal system.
Which makes them vulnerable to quick removal.
Exactly. It really raises questions about whether those constitutional rights are being met in practice.
That lack of legal support seems fundamental.
It is. And then you have El Salvador's international obligations. Treaties like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, they prohibit sending people back to persecution or inhumane treatment.
But there's pressure from the U.S. to deport.
Right. There's often this conflict between U.S. demands for high deportation numbers and El Salvador's own laws and international commitments. It's a difficult position. There are ongoing discussions in El Salvador about potential legal reforms, though, to try and better protect deportees' rights.
Looking ahead then, if we do see a return to stricter U.S. policies in 2025 under a potential Trump administration, what are the likely consequences for El Salvador?
The big fear is just a massive increase in deportations, numbers going way up.
Which would strain El Salvador's resources.
Enormously. Services, infrastructure, the job market. It could make existing socioeconomic problems even worse. Politically, you might see shifts in alliances in the region, maybe more tension, and there's a real worry about crime.
How so?
If large numbers of people are returned, struggle to reintegrate, can't find work, there's a risk some could be pushed towards organized crime out of desperation.
And the social fabric, the impact on communities.
You likely see more mental health issues stemming from family separation and the trauma of it all. It really highlights why a human rights focus is so critical in migration policy, rather than just enforcement.
This has been incredibly insightful. It really underscores how complex this is and how high the stakes are. El Salvador's deportation policies, especially thinking about a potential future scenario with the U.S., they raise profound human rights questions.
Absolutely. We've talked about the impact on individuals, families, whole communities already facing violence, poverty. It's immense.
Understanding all these pieces, the international pressure, the realities inside El Salvador, it seems crucial.
It really is. You can't look at any piece in isolation. It's all connected.
So let's leave our listeners with this thought. Given how interconnected migration and human rights are globally, what responsibility do we all have as individuals, as part of the international community, to make sure people who are displaced or deported are treated humanely, and that the policies governing this are actually just? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.